Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm watching Why Don't We Shoot Nuclear Waste into Space by SocietySucks. The first thing that comes to my mind is that it would simply be too expensive to shoot nuclear waste into space, but there's probably also other reasons, so let's check it out. Link to the original video will be down in the description below.
Here in the SocietySucks labs, we test very important ideas to see what happens when you blow things up or play with black holes. Many of you suggested that we look into an idea that sounds reasonable: shooting nuclear waste into space. It's one of those concepts that seems like an easy fix for one of the main problems with the nuclear energy. But it turns out this idea is not just bad, but horribly bad, and it gets worse the longer you think about it. Why is that?
Really? I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? You shoot it into space and there you go, it's gone. There's definitely more to it, but let's see.
What is nuclear waste? Nuclear waste is a fuzzy term and comes in categories which vary from country to country. But in general, there are three broad levels. 90% is low-level nuclear waste, tools, gloves, or trash used at a nuclear facility that could be weakly contaminated with some short-lived radioactivity. This stuff is generally safe for normal disposal. 7% is intermediate-level nuclear waste, mostly materials that have been in close proximity to a reactor core long enough to become dangerously radioactive. With proper handling, it's either safely buried or melted down and mixed into glass or concrete and stored deep underground.
Safely buried, like the US did on those islands?
So 97% of nuclear waste is similar to toxic byproducts from other industries.
It's not really
great,
a problem.
Not terrible. We can handle it. The remaining 3% is where our problems begin. High-level nuclear waste is very concentrated spent fuel taken out of a reactor core. Formerly uranium, it's now made of various dangerous and often highly radioactive elements. As a bonus, it's also incredibly hot and not easy to handle at all. This is what we want to shoot into space.
Fantastic.
All in all, around 440 active nuclear reactors create about 11,000 tons of high-level nuclear waste each year. Since 1954, we've accumulated 400,000 tons of dangerous radioactive waste. Most countries are dealing with it by not dealing with it and kicking the can towards the future.
Yep.
Great. So let's launch it into space.
Who cares? The next generation can deal with it.
Space is big, and nobody lives there. So it seems perfect for yeeting away this mess.
Well, maybe don't shoot your satellites.
Problems though. Problem one: stuff ain't cheap.
Okay, so
even though spaceflight is getting more affordable, it's still extremely expensive. Just to get something into low Earth orbit costs on.
So it is better to just not deal with it. Just bury it and leave it for someone else to deal with, rather than actually spending the money to shoot it into space. Along with the other problems that they're probably going to talk about.
Average about $4,000 per kilogram. Putting that into perspective, it costs about $1,600 to mine, separate and fabricate 1 kilogram of nuclear fuel, so launching waste into space has suddenly made nuclear fuel for reactors way more expensive and greatly increased the cost of the electricity they produce. To launch one reactor's worth of nuclear waste would cost at least $100 million per year. To deal with all the 440 operational nuclear power plants' high-level nuclear waste would cost some $44 billion per year for space launch.
Holy crap, okay, 44 billion. And now we have to think about how there's already 400,000 tons that has accumulated over the last 5 to 6 decades. Yeah, that would be very expensive.
Before packaging, transport and security costs are added. Okay, let's pretend we don't care.
Okay, never mind.
Currently, we couldn't shoot all the nuclear waste into space even if we wanted to. There just aren't enough rockets. In 2021, we saw a record 135 launches into space. If we repurposed each of those rockets and filled them all with nuclear waste, the total amount that could be lifted into a low Earth orbit, which is the closest orbit above the atmosphere, is nearly 800 tons.
That's nothing.
We'd need at least 14 times more rockets to handle just today's nuclear waste, let alone get rid of the hundreds of thousands.
You'd have to also get all the materials to even create those rockets, which just shooting nuclear waste into space would honestly be a waste of materials, time, and money. So yeah, no, it's just not worth it.
Thousands of tons in temporary storage. we would need to create entire new space industries to keep up with the demand for giant, toxic space trash trucks. And it gets worse. Problem 2, space is hard. We only made the calculation for low Earth orbit, where we send most of our rockets and satellites.
Well, it
Lifting
couldn't
the
be
space
sent
around
there
Earth with thousands of casks of spent nuclear
because
fuel
of
would
collisions.
be a nightmare for space junk management and satellite collision avoidance. Worse still, at this altitude,
Oh, that
there's
would just
still a
rain
little bit of
down, yeah.
atmosphere causing a tiny bit of drag, so we might have nuclear waste raining down from space within just a few years. Experts would call
Perfect.
this a huge problem. Clearly, we have to launch our waste further. If we wanted to send it to, perhaps, the moon, we either need way more rockets or we need to build much bigger ones, making it even more expensive. A single Saturn V.
So all those costs, those calculations, was just for shooting it into lower Earth orbit. And that was already incredibly expensive, so yeah, this is never gonna happen.
The rocket used by the Apollo program, which cost around 1.5 billion adjusted for inflation per launch, could get about 43.5 tons from the Earth to the moon.
Oh my god, that is literally
So
nothing.
we need about 260 Saturn V rocket launches every year. And of course, using the moon as target practice for nuclear waste-tipped rockets kind of makes a huge mess. So maybe don't aim for anything. Space is empty. Do we really need a target?
Shoot it in a
Shooting
random
waste
direction.
in any random direction is, you guessed it, also a bad idea. Orbits are loops, which means they have a
Oh yeah,
tendency to come back to
that
where
could
they
also go
started.
wrong.
Put enough in the sky in random directions, and you'll get one back eventually. So we'd want to launch our nuclear waste deep into space, which means we need even bigger rockets that would be even more expensive. Not that we would be completely safe then. Earth might run into these interplanetary caskets at some time in the far future and experience a pretty meteor shower made from
Okay, so yeah, just
radioactive
don't
dust.
shoot it into space then. Just
Okay,
bury it
how
on the
about we
ground.
shoot it into the sun? Ironically, the sun is pretty hard to hit. While the sun has very strong gravity, everything on Earth is moving with respect to the sun, including the rockets that we launch, meaning
Okay.
a rocket would have to
Yeah, that
cancel
makes
out
sense.
all the orbital motion it has around the sun so it can stop orbiting and fall in. Because of this, it's actually easier to launch a rocket entirely out of the solar system than it is to launch it into the sun. But to do either of these things, we need even bigger rockets, probably the biggest we've ever built. Nothing works. The thing is, it gets even worse.
how
Problem
could
3,
this possibly
rockets
get
go
worse?
Rocket engineering has taken huge
They could
steps since the
explode.
Apollo era. We've made them relatively safe. We've mostly replaced the toxic explosive cancer fuels of the
Yeah, imagine that. You're shooting a rocket with tens of tons of nuclear waste and it just explodes not long after liftoff. Now all of that is going to rain back down onto the surface and there you go. You have a nuclear disaster on your hands.
past decades with much saner mixes of liquid oxygen and hydrogen or kerosene. The newest designs even land themselves so that they can be reused. And yet, out of the 146 launches in 2021, there were 11 failures, which means that a sizable number of our rockets carrying high-level radioactive waste would be exploding on the launch pad, or in the worst case, disassembling at high altitude or crashing from hypersonic speeds. Each failure would be at least equivalent to a mini Chernobyl, but instead of being contained under a slab of concrete, spread throughout the atmosphere. Radioactive particles could make their way to faraway places by riding on the winds. Most would fall into the ocean, but some would land on the inhabited parts of the world. They could cover farmlands and get concentrated into our food or enter our
And now
water
everybody
supply,
has cancer.
which is, well, bad. Imagine regular large-scale
And
nuclear
radiation
disasters
poisoning.
happening. People wouldn't be happy. Conclusion and opinion part. Nuclear waste is scary, but the fear of it and horrible ideas like shooting it into space reveals how bad we are at understanding risk, because the largest amounts of radioactive elements like uranium and radon are actually released by coal. Burning millions of tons of coal each year leaves ash as a waste product that includes about 36,000 tons of radioactive materials.
I had no
Less
idea about
radioactive
this.
than high-level nuclear waste, but there's also a lot more of it, and it's handled way less carefully. Some of this ash
Wow.
is caught by filters, but most is
I have never once heard anyone mention this. Absolutely nothing.
simply pushed back into leaky mines, shoved into piles exposed to the wind, or poured into ponds that regularly spill into rivers and lakes. Living within 1.6 kilometers of an ash pile increases your cancer risk up to 2,000 times over the acceptable limit. And this is on top of other toxic chemicals like heavy metals and, of course, their massive CO2 emissions. And yet, while nuclear energy is
no one talks about this?
May only be a transitory technology.
I mean, I guess that makes sense though. You wouldn't really associate coal with nuclear waste, would you?
Nuclear power plants are a harder sell than coal. Nuclear waste and the lack of willingness to deal with it are a real issue. It's not insurmountable though. There are good methods to handle it, like burying it deep underground or reprocessing some of it into new fuel. But however we ultimately deal with this issue, we hope one thing is clear. Shooting nuclear waste into space is one of the worst ideas ever.
It sounds like such a great fix, and yet it's the worst thing we could do. Crazy how something that seems like a perfect solution is actually probably the worst thing we could do. The fact that there's so much nuclear waste from just coal is very surprising. Like I said before, never heard anybody mention that. Not once. So yeah, the best solution is probably to just bury it on the ground. It's also going to be a lot less expensive than any other solution they can probably come up with. Well anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you're interested, why not watch this video right here? And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.